Hello, everybody. How are you doing? It's technically 2 minutes early, but just imagine that I am wandering into class, letting the conversation die down a little, listening to all your little adventures over the weekend. I'm turning on the computer. I'm noticing that this is now I got to pull down the screen and I got to boot her all up, and I have to make idle conversation. But many of you are used to that. I'm seeing numbers go down. Oh, okay. There's six of you, according to this. When I first clued on, there was like nine. Anyway, greetings all. I have just received an email. Maybe you received it as well. It's sort of a basic message for. Hi, Kima. It's the basic message for. It went out to employees. I don't know if it went out to students as well. That they are now officially closing the actual campus because of Nova Scotia's state of emergency. They are locking all the doors. They actually locked all the doors on campus apart from one before they told us that they were going to do that. So guess who had to walk around the entire circumference of the campus looking for an open door? We're like, yeah, let's make that announcement 4 hours later. So hooray. Hi, Charlotte. So yeah, the campus is closed. So the next time you see me, I guess I'll be doing this from my house. I guess. Figure that out. I really just need a place with a strong internet connection. The house isn't necessarily an ideal situation right now for reasons that are none of your business. But we will get going. Hi, Chloe. So anyway, let's see. Just to sort of technical things about last class. Hey, first of all, you notice that I was able to do this. Oh, the thing is coming up, so I get this nice link that I can put on ahead of time and not have just a picture of the me walking back and forth in front of a bookcase for 10 minutes. That'll make my editing job that much easier, no less. So that's a good thing. There are now two versions of last class. One is the link to basically the equivalent of this. It's actually the same link that you would have clicked on last time, and that just goes to a pure sort of YouTube archived version of it, and that has all the chat. So if you want to sort of see the chat and go through what other people said, that's there. I also have a slightly more usable version. I edited it down. I chopped off that first 10 minutes, and I've incorporated the slides into it. So it's kind of more like almost like sort of standard YouTube video as opposed to just my head for 45 minutes. So that's there. Now I'm going to do that with this one, and I'm going to do that with all the other ones. It doesn't take a huge amount of time, and it's better. I actually had it all done by Saturday, but then Moodle was down for upgrades on Saturday. So I only put it up this morning, I guess. What else? If you are doing the extra credit assignments, the idea is that it's prospective. I want stuff about the upcoming reading. So don't answer, give me reflections on what you just saw or watched the video or something. The whole point is for me to get more stuff. Like if you can't, like say all these lovely people like John, James, and Kima and Charlotte weren't able to sort of show up and ask questions and help stimulate the conversation, it would just be this for a very long time. The idea is the extra credit. You've done readings. You're like, I have a question, Professor, and then that can get me going. It's cool that you have insights about what happened last, but that is not the nature of the assignment. So for the next assignment, read the when we're doing the Ostensio Mori, I want questions about that, not about what we're going to be talking about today. So, hi, Evie. I'm not going to dwell on this too much longer because we're already 4.5 minutes in and I haven't actually done any real teaching yet. But once again, I hope you're safe. I hope you're staying away from the people that you don't need to be near, and then you are holding near and dear those that are close to you. Anyway, I am hearing bits and pieces of people. It's like sort of friends of friends or friends who are more seriously self-quarantining and so on. There's a peer of mine, Frank DeCaro, or more like a sort of. He is a folklorist. I didn't know him very well. We had one or two conversations, but he had a he was already in a convalescent state, and he passed away yesterday or the day before, and it's sort of COVID adjacent. So yeah, it's starting to hit home, and I hope everything is fine with you. Okay, so what are we talking about today? We are talking about Andrea's chapter 3, supernatural contagion, Slender Man, suicide, violence, and slender sickness. Yeah, Annabelle is fashionably late. So, just one of the things, and I've experienced this like the last time I taught urban legends and the last time I taught about Slender Man, when we were doing the contemporary legend special issue on Slender Man, is the reminding people that most of the class have lived in North America for much of their life and sort of know, even if you are of this internet generation and the Slender Man's been around for the better part of 10 years, you know it's sort of an internet creation. But I've had a lot of international students over the years who, just do not have that sort of North American fluency with their supernatural belief traditions, and just assumed that the Slender Man had been a character in sort of standard North American folklore. Didn't quite realize the origin. So I'm going to sort of run down a fairly brief history of Slender Man, and you are going to when the slides are up there, it's gold. The slides I have are such beauty, but. So basically, for those who don't know, it arose as a contest. It arose basically as one of those sort of challenges that appeared on the Something Awful forums. And the Something Awful was just like, post a weird ass picture. And this dude who went by the name of Victor Surge, although his real name is Eric Knudsen, he just contributed these two images. And so one of their sort of neat things, one of their real triggers, is the way that they introduce this level of ambiguity. They're fragmentary. So instead of having some like weird ass, big old Lovecraftian scary thing, you just get the glimmer of it. You have the name, the caption is kind of key to it as well. So if you look on the PowerPoint, you see slides 3 and 4 have the two photos that Victor Surge posted with the first caption. Oh, hi, Andrea. The first caption: we didn't want to go, we didn't want to kill them, but its persistent silence and outstretched arms horrified and comforted us at the same time. 1983, photographer unknown, presumed dead, with this lugubrious-looking gentleman in the front. And then photo 2, which doesn't refer to as the Slender Man, deformity cited as film defects by officials. Fire at library occurred 1 week later. Actual photograph confiscated as evidence, 1986. So, I mean, we talked the entire time about how legends are fragments, and the more fragmentary the data, the more creative we are in trying to sort of incorporate it. So Victor Surge more or less introduced this fragment, which allowed and invited the story to be cumulatively completed. And so a lot of people are interested in Slender Man as just an example of this sort of communal creation idea, that more or less motifs were received. Yes, we can attribute it to Victor Surge, but more than anything, they just appeared in some point in time. And then we kind of have this line in the sand where we see collectively people are adding to it, subtracting from it, building upon it, creating narratives, creating backstory, creating fan art, and just using it the same way that we use a traditional motif or a traditional story. We're ambivalent about it. It's similar to Legend Quest in that it is something that we will participate in. Oh, Chloe's mom is here. Hi, Chloe's mom. We're participating in the same way that at the time of its performance, we are sort of more invested in the idea of its belief because it kind of abuts that idea of play. So it's the fragmentary nature of Slender Man that I think is like the most interesting. It is a creation. There is readings you can do to talk about Victor Surge himself, and the nature of ownership and what happens, which is a very 20th, 21st century idea. Although, so on one hand, we want to acknowledge that this is at one part an original creation, but it has eclipsed its origins. And again, because this is mostly in a it's a post-literate, a post-capitalist idea time frame. And so we are very invested in such things as authenticity and canonicity and timeline, and sort of what is the Slender Man story. There seems to be a very thick interest in sort of participating at the boundaries of the stories and what is and what doesn't qualify. But more than anything, it seems to be less a matter of specific arbitration or like almost, different from like a what is, canonical Buffyverse, and rather one of the ways of seeing whether something fits into that collective mythos is how it is incorporated, reposted, commented on. As opposed to something that sort of falls on deaf ears. So again, the internet provides this interesting we're talking about, like obviously sort of a pre-internet, but even a pre-literate culture. We really just have the vestiges of sort of the collective, cumulative, what has been considered the most successful over time. And that's one of the reasons that we're interested in authenticity and so on, that we don't see those sort of fragmentary bad performances. Internet allows you to see those bad performances, but the fragments are things that get to be filled in. It is just a matrix for ideas. So again, this idea of the mythos, which is their own term, I think we might balk a little bit about employing it. We folklorists might balk a little bit about using the term mythos, save for that is what the emic term is for this. Yes, the emic term is for this particular process that they have decided. They collectively seem to have settled on the term mythos as a way of trying to understand backstory, and fundamentally it's like the expanded Slender Man universe. So lots of really interesting fan art came out very early, and it was something that existed on the internet, and it was something that wasn't. This is one of those things where it just reveals my age, in that I knew about it only by virtue of folklorists being excited about it and like, hey, are you interested in Slender Man? Are you talking about Slender Man in your classes? And I'm like, no, I hadn't really come across it. I only had come across it through the literature. But then in June of 2014, coincidentally, I think I was in Prague at the time at the meeting of Contemporary Legend in Prague that Peter Janacek was hosting, and that there's a death in Wisconsin. Maybe this is the story that it's the story that Andrea alludes to in the chapter, where two young adolescent girls dragged a third adolescent girl into the woods and assaulted her, and in a way that was meant to be assuming it was meant to actually kill her. She survived. She crawled to safety, and then when the girls were apprehended by the police, they attributed it to Candyman, Slender Man, that they were basically trying to sort of please Slender Man. So that's when it entered into this, not simply into the public view, but into the moral panic. Who is this Slender Man? Who is the person responsible for telling these stories? And then we have this now separate dynamic of the internet itself as a cause of threat. So if Slender Man has this association with it already, some people suggest, as slide 8, I guess, talks about, that there's an interesting comparison between Slender Man and the internet to begin with, in that they are both anonymous, they are both ambiguous, they are both menacing, or at least they have opportunities for menace. They're both potentially luring of children, or they are seductive in a particular way, and they seem to be beyond the controls of authorities or society. My child is up at the desk in their room. So not only is it something, does the story seem to suggest something to the people who are part of that tradition themselves, that Slenderman seems to be representing something ominous, but also then externally, it becomes an idea of threat. And so in the past 5 or 6 years, not because of Slender Man, but echoing Slender Man and echoing the moral panics that arose about that, you have things like Momo, or you have things like the Blue Whale Challenge. You have these notions of that the internet is a specifically dark place with malevolent actors and that they are luring children. And if you know anything about Momo and Blue Whale, you know that those are stories about threats. Those aren't actually threats that exist. And it's something that becomes associated with it, the challenges that are there. A couple of people have been saying things. Mythos kind of like canon then, or is the mythos flexible? And Brian saying, I remember that being all over the internet. Yeah. Mythos kind of like canon. In a way. I think for one thing, they might be trying to not use the word canon per se, because of the nature of because a canon, at least the way that I think it is understood in popular culture terms, canon implies a very fixed set of texts from a particular authority. So, like the 9 Star Wars films, the seasons 1 through 7, and then the season 8 comic book of Buffy. What the creator decided upon, and then those sort of form the basis of what is and isn't allowed, or really what is and isn't. It becomes the measure, becomes the canon in that Greek sense of, canon that I sort of explained in class one day. In that, if you are going to expand it into sort of fan fiction or sort of extended artistic creations, those things need to measure up against this. But it's canon, so mythos is equivalent to canon, except that there isn't actually set definitive texts in the same way that there are Star Trek episodes or official Doctor Who episodes or whatever. It only exists in terms of fan creations. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't ones with greater precedent or things that have been established, things like, what's it called? Marble Hornets, that video series. But more than anything, it's kind of, rather than this is the list and everything else needs to measure against the list, it's more like a clump of consensus, and then it's more malleable. There is not the one Joss Whedon, Gene Roddenberry, Mr. Doctor Who authority. It's all sort of by common consensus, as it were. And of course, it has actually eclipsed Victor Surge as well. He has made some issues about copyright, especially when movies started to be produced and so on. So, I mean, he has been making claims, at least about that there is an intellectual property there, but the entirety of it is not his intellectual property. So mythos kind of is in this halfway work. Let's make a folklore canon and a folklore extended universe. Later, we will start a film industry and make the folklore cinematic universe. Yeah, I was thinking about that. Here's an aside. It was very strange when, in the 19th century, you did start having things in children's literature like Fairyland, where all of a sudden you were suggesting that the characters in Brothers Grimm or various folktales lived in some kind of same place. So you had this extended universe, this sort of how these all interrelate to each other early. But again, it's a very weird, rigid capitalist 19th century mode. The how does everything fit in the idea of timelines and so on. So you're not actually crazy for thinking that. There is a kind of a strange tie-in. So I promised myself that I wasn't going to go for 45 minutes like I did last time. One of the things that she brings up is a concept called the folkloresque. And Brian was in the popular culture class, so he would remember this. But the folkloresque was a term that Michael David Foster and Jeffrey Tolbert more or less coined. And the idea is that within popular culture, there are creations that are not trying to represent themselves as traditional. So they're not like inventions that are then being presented to people as this is an authentic piece of folk culture, which is sometimes called fake lore, or that was a Richard Dawson term, or sometimes, taking a step back, it's kind of like folklorismus, by taking something and then attributing traditional qualities to it. The folkloresque is the creation of new texts that are very reminiscent of, but not making the claim to be actually coterminous with, folk traditions. A lot of like the Studio Ghibli stuff is a good example of that, where they are clearly taking elements from Japanese folklore, but they aren't actually emulating individual specific stories. Or sometimes another way, insight into the folkloresque, is the sort of the creation of folklore within a universe. So the idea that folklore has, if you create some kind of world, that within it there is something folkloric therein. And in the anthology called The Folkloresque that Foster and Tolbert edited, one of my favorite articles is about the Tales of Beetle Bard in Harry Potter, the Harry Potter universe. That last in Deathly Hallows, where there's that book of children's stories that it's where you get the tale of the Deathly Hallows to begin with. And so the idea is that these are the fairy tales that wizards tell each other. And, on one hand, of course, the element of magic, when magic is normative, has a different factor to it. But the other thing about it is the way that within that universe, there's a kind of strange, what's it called? Euhemerism about it. The notion that folklore was actually the story, there was histories that then had increasingly narrative elements thrown upon it until it becomes something much more powerful. So Euhemerism is about that the Greek myths were actually about real people that just had mythological elements sort of superimposed upon them, but the basic story is actually history. So that's a common sense understanding of how folklore might actually be an argument. Andrea's saying, like the fan theories about Frozen being related to other Disney movies. Yeah, the Pixar canon and so on, how everything is related beyond simply clever cross references. The difference between like a cross reference and like a sort of tongue in cheek thing, and then they all exist in the same universe. I hate that. When we're not talking about this, when time is not of the essence, when Armageddon isn't happening, we will sit down and we will talk about why continuity in comic books is just boring white boy bullshit. But anyway, we move on. So one of the things the folkloresque kind of refers to, again, they use that term fuzzy illusions, the idea that it's not the thing, but it's kind of like the thing. And Slender Man is a good example of that fuzzy illusion thing as well, in that there is no narrative that exactly coincides with Slender Man prior to its quote-unquote spontaneous creation through the Victor Surge photographs, but you can see how it is borrowing elements of the eerie, the uncanny, and so on. So it gives it that impression of traditional. Folkloresque is a cool term because it eliminates that idea of delineating between authentic and inauthentic. More than anything, it's just about sort of saying that people can intelligently use allusions to tradition in order to give the patina of traditionality to something without it being inherently an effort at deliberate misrepresentation. So the folkloresque and fuzzy illusions are neat terms. I want them to do something more with the folkloresque, and I keep on forgetting the camera's not in my eye. I want them to do something more with the folkloresque because there's things like they could be talking about cameras. Cameras. They could be talking about music. I've never heard folkloresque referred to like when it comes to sort of traditional music or sort of acoustic music, where it kind of sounds like it could be something from somewhere. It has the allusions to world beat or folk or traditional music of some description, but it's not. Yeah, there's stuff like that. There's also like occupational folklore, folkloresque occupational folk life would be really interesting stuff. But I digress. They're coming out with a second anthology. Maybe I'll throw something in there. So Annabelle. Oh man, I want to write about that. About what in particular, Annabelle and Kima? Yeah, Walking Sam. The Walking Sam thing, as Andrea suggests, there's not a huge amount of precedence to the Slender Man thing, but we're doing it. I have thoughts on folkloresque music some other time. Oh, of course. There we go. Yeah, all of Celtic music you could potentially describe as folkloresque. You wouldn't make yourself any friends, but you wouldn't be making yourself any friends with the kind of people that you want to make friends with. So anyway, you're good. So this article, finally, let's actually get to the chapter, is about this notion of, again, tying it into the theme of contagion. Like Andrew's saying, like Barrett's Privateers. I don't know. I just think that there is something. I'm thinking more like a Mumford and Sons kind of stuff. I mean, you could make an argument that Stan Rogers was doing parody, and parody might be a form of the folkloresque. And indeed, in that book, they talk about the folkloresque as a parody as one of the strategies of folkloresque. Who is calling me at home? Oh, it's the general announcement. Overkill is in campus. Okay. What was I talking about? So parody does work there. I mean, parody is making allusions, but they're less fuzzy and they're more oblique. Oh yeah, write that down. That's good. That's my shit right there. Okay. So anyway, I got to stop talking about acoustic music, people. Armageddon happening. So Andrea is talking about, again, within the context of a book about contagion. She's talking about Slender Man. Exactly. And of course, it isn't a disease in the same way. But first of all, the way that she identifies the concept of slender sickness. So you have something, again, within the mythos, within the sort of the large, nebulous, and yet cohesive understanding of what Slender Man kinda is. You have the articulation of this notion of slender sickness, and in something that's really insightful, she started just identifying what those symptoms were, and are there any other diseases? And she noticed the relationship between how people are representing what slender sickness is and the warning signs that people are meant to look for people who are victims of bullying. And so the idea, because we've already established that Slender Man has this notion of threat, of menace, of being alone, of seemingly safe spaces being unsafe, all those issues of border crossing, all those issues of matter out of place, all those issues of dirt, all those issues of contagion and contamination. So the idea of the slender sickness is kind of if Slender Man represents something, does it actually have a sort of can we make a tighter correlation, a tighter relationship between what Slender Man is, what is the menacing threat behind Slender Man, and what actually comes to the point. And this goes back to the issue of tellability, in that, again, what I was talking about last class and what's part of the introductory chapter, the tellability is that issue of when there are experiences that are the consequences of trauma, or I mean, there's also the experiences that are that we don't have a name or a metonym for, but where there is something that we wish to articulate, but either we don't have the vocabulary, or articulating it is in itself an additional cause of re-triggering trauma. are there sometimes other ways we do it? And again, we don't reduce all of folklore to, or reduce the use of metaphor to, well, it's clearly representing something else. Metaphor obviously represents something else. That's why they call it a metaphor. But what I mean is that it's not always a matter of not being able to tell stuff. Starting to cycle. Let me get back on point. But is there something that is being communicated by the Slender Man mythos, the Slender Man stories, and particularly certain forms of fan fiction within the Slender Man mythos that are representative of something that otherwise can't be told, that otherwise fall under that broad rubric of untellability? And so the identifying slender sickness, and then, okay, well, let's just present this as a possible lens, that it's actually about bullying, then reading the fan fiction through that lens of bullying as what Slender Man is sort of actually about, there's elements that starts to really make sense. It builds on sort of the idea, first of all, again, is the supernatural as a form of contagion, a breach between two different realms that shouldn't be breached. It's not us and some ethnic other. It is, of course, the living and the dead, or the immanent and the transcendent, or some kind of category differentiation that is breached. Now, we breach that all the time through religious practice, but those breaches tend to be marshaled and ordained and communicated to us through specific public ritual and ordained ritual, as it were, religious tradition, sort of with a capital R and a capital T, so in the same way that myth is sort of the public pronouncement of itself, those are the channels by which we connect to the transcendent, or the immanent or the supernatural. And then we sort of have this different area, which is, if legend is like a private, personal, ambiguous communication, we sort of have these sort of rituals, which are almost what we deal with when we're talking about like the arcane, or the slightly, perhaps sort of different belief traditions that are expressly different from the authoritarian mainstream, but they're also about ambiguities and breaking down categories. So I think that's, we are okay. We as a people, if we're operating within institutional religious traditions, we have proper avenues and proper avatars for dealing with the supernatural. And it's when we start taking things into our own hands, non-institutional, interpersonal, that's where it starts to get super weird. I'm having fun. I'm inventing stuff while we're here. One of the things that we also need to remember is that Slender Man is a dumb story. And I'm just putting that little scare quotes around it, because it's like what Mealy and Melly and Bird and Libby Tucker and Carl Lindahl, to a certain extent, although he was also talking about that sort of folk religious aspect in San Antonio, is that the participants themselves are often understanding themselves to be they see it as close to play. They see it as something that is in the coolness of remove from it. It is something that is potentially silly, potentially playful. It's there for a thrill, but it is almost meant to be not taken seriously. And yet, at the moment of its performance, when you go to the Black Angel in Iowa City, when you go to Haugs Road, when you go to all these places, there's a sort of an affectivity there, a palpable sense of the possibility that what you are experiencing is that transcendent supernatural connection, is something horrible. So we want to remember that this both and is in place, and that we don't want to immediately dismiss the people who are involved in the Slender Man mythos as foolish, naive believers in that sort of like Hufford's criticism, or how Hufford associates traditions of disbelief. It's like, they're just doing something. Blah, 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 blah. Neither do we want to necessarily suggest that they are all simultaneously, that they are all participating in it cynically or merely as play. It is that same ambiguity that gives it the frisson, but you want to sort of establish that as something that's going on. So yeah, that's a great slide 11. I had this much more fine. Like Legend Quests, participation in the Slenderman mythos as audience and/or as creator hovers near play. The knowing it's not real, yet having genuinely affective responses, but also becomes a shared frame of reference for articulating felt experience. So think about Hufford and the experiential source hypothesis. Think about Goldstein and the scientific rationalism, and think about, of course, as always, go back to Ellis and think about the name, the metonym and the name cycle. We have legends occur. They are told until they are stale. They really only exist as sort of a metonym to be invoked in full later on. But those metonyms kind of enter back into it as the name of that experience that then gives birth to the next iteration, or the articulation of the next experience, and so on. So cyclical that way. So something may be being experienced. Oh, this was good. I remember typing. Sometimes it's a good thing. Something may be being experienced that finds articulation through the motifs of this received recent crowdsourced text, because that's the nature of narrative traditions, irrespective of their time depth. So just because something, came out after Friends went off the air doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be found meaningful to people in a very deep way. B, it describes experience that prior narratives don't articulate as well, especially about life lived online. So, I mean, maybe it was able to name the experience that didn't have a precedent before this. And C, the lived experience, of course, might be untellable. So this is the metaphor that best employs it. And then the question is Slenderman a bully? Slide 12. Thought that was a decent way of phrasing it. The question is Slenderman a bully? In the fan fiction written by primarily adolescent, from what I gather, and certainly people who are always identifying themselves as female, and the protagonists are female in that, Slenderman appears to be an avenger of the bullied. He provides unbidden he provides and commits retribution on the protagonist's tormentors, often in ridiculously visceral, violent sort of ways. And that being said, he is potentially he's a parental figure. Potentially he's a paternal figure. He's a patriarchal figure. You got to throw in a whole bunch of interesting gender questions right there. But at the very least, he seems to act in situations where presumably the person who's been experiencing this bullying and torment hasn't seen other people intervening. So there's a kind of rescuer aspect to it. There's a good stuff on page 57. There's good stuff throughout, but I just want to read this particularly choice quote. The authors are upset that their parents and other adults cannot help in these situations, especially in cases of cyberbullying. They also indicate that in some way they understand that violence is not the solution to the problem and that it has consequences, which is why the main characters never ask for vengeance or even beg Slenderman not to harm the bullies. However, it is clear that the authors are engaging in a type of revenge fantasy, which likely gives them a therapeutic release from their negative emotions. They imagine what they would do if there were no consequences and find some relief in what their imaginations conjure. Lastly, we see that the authors understand that these stories may be therapeutic to others, which may be one reason why they share these stories as well as why they leave the main characters unnamed. The anonymity of the main character and the bullies may allow readers to substitute themselves and their own bullies into the already established narrative, allowing the readers to live vicariously through the tale. Oh, that's choice stuff right there. So Slenderman seems to be doing something else, and then doing something in that line. Yeah, Slenderman is a kind of anti-hero, basically. And Charlotte's saying, I've heard of some people going on legend trips to forests and stuff to find Slenderman similar to Bigfoot, but haven't met anyone who's actually gone. Yeah. This is all based on Brian asking about legend quests. There's stuff that's being done on Legend Quest and Slenderman, isn't it? But mainly it does seem to be, Legend quests in virtual spaces. It's kind of like traveling to the dark web, as it were. That is going from the safety of, I don't know, Ask Jeeves into the dark web. And then the last thing she talks about is the tall man, which is based on the attribution of a sort of a Slender Man-esque figure, Walking Sam, the tall man, for the attribution to that creature as for a rise in teen suicides on the Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota. That's in Oglala Lakota peoples. And there's accounts both of sightings of a physical character, but also of videos with the character featured in them who are inciting youth to commit suicide. So it is, again, it's similar to the challenges. It's similar to MoMA and Blue Whale in that it is something that the great anonymity of the internet as something that is intentionally causing harm to children. It does seem to be a hybrid of potentially an extant figure, frightening figure, a figure that might be associated with whiteness, but also a figure that is associated with menace. So unlike the Slender Man, at least in the fan fiction versions, this is not a protector by any stretch. I mean, and in the fan fiction versions, there's often a sort of, now I am indebted to Slender Man, so he's not pure kindness, but he's not necessarily the threat to you, the threat to the reader. He enters into the sort of uses violence, but for your benefit. The tall man seems to be a different version of this. And so, again, if there are, was it Kima who just mentioned that earlier? Or, yeah, Kima, we're talking about Walking Sam. Yeah, there are sort of, you can make an argument that there are folklore-esque, there are fuzzy allusions in this narrative to First Nation spirituality. Again, one of the things we want to be cautious about is this notion of where the folkloresque is meant to be sort of, this is clearly a creation. This is a piece of popular culture with an identifiable author that is making these allusions to the traditional, as making these fuzzy allusions, as opposed to, we don't know the precise origins of this. So but it's working in the same way. Basically, how I would sort of frame it is that, I mean, we always take, again, the folk are always contemporary to their times, and they take whatever is at their disposal in order to find meaning. And the idea of incorporating something like Slender Man and First Nations spirituality doesn't strike me as odd, and it doesn't strike me as deliberate. It doesn't strike me as something that is, I mean, it's not, I'm taking a little bit of column A, I'm taking a little bit of column B. It seems to be an organic aspect, as you have a people who are both ancient and modern at the same time, as we are all, to a certain extent, somewhat ancient, and we are all modern, and how much we sort of incorporate this. And so, again, one of the things, one of the issues about Blue Whale, for those who don't know, Blue Whale was, in theory, it was an online challenge where every day you were asked to do something more and more daring. And on the 30th day, it was kill yourself. And so it was something that was reported in Russia. It had been reported in India as well, and it sort of seeped throughout the world. But it was basically a post hoc fear where it was discussed in boards that were frequented by teenagers as, oh, there is this thing. And because it was discussed when parents were, after the fact, parents of children, adolescents who had committed suicide, when they were trying to figure out possible reasons and went on and checked their browsing history, they came across these sites and then presumed that there was a direct correlation, that fundamentally they were engaged in ostension, that they were acting out these things. So there's sort of no demonstrable proof that anyone has ever participated in the blue whale challenge, but it's a very real threat. People have gone to Russian prisons because of being understood as being behind blue whale. So it speaks to this, that you have an anomaly. You have an anomaly of something that is fundamentally tragic. Why are our young people killing themselves? And you also have these narratives that might be an emergence, they might have encountered, and they seem to coalesce, and then they become something of a process. They explain away, perhaps, but they at least provide some kind of context for the for the situation. I'll try and have a stronger sentence. They are, again, if legend emerges, if narratives like these emerge when the truth is either fragmentary or unsatisfactory, or the official stories are not forthcoming, there's a vacuum that needs to be filled, because people hate fragment and people hate vacuums, and so they'll sort of this provides an answer, and it might be an answer that is somewhat satisfying. And then, I mean, satisfying at least in terms of it has that sense of completeness. And then you have it doubly complicated, however, because first, we don't want to necessarily go into it with this, they are coming across with some kind of weird story in order to account for this thing. We don't want to take a potential explanatory device and impose it upon people and deny the validity of their experience, because some people are referring to specific sightings that they are having. So we do want to employ that sort of Huffordian experience-centered approach. So it's complicated by a number of things. A, you have the traditions of belief and traditions of disbelief coming into contact with each other. B, you have, of course, the sort of the people who are struggling with / justifying post hoc the colonial exercise that introduced issues of the reserve and introduced the marginalization of First Nations people to begin with, and again, the sort of inherent sense of disparagement towards Native belief systems. So it's like, oh well, they think that it's this, and then you have that as a cudgel. It's a dull weapon at best. And you also have it's built on these kind of sickening exoteric assumptions about what life is like on the reserve anyway. And so, again, it's all sort of framed in these people. So all of a sudden you have this, bye, Andrea. All of a sudden you have this harsh dilemma of now using this Slender Man or Slender Man-esque character to explain this sort of fundamental sickness. It might be a metaphorical sickness, and there's lots of stuff in here about violence as a contagion in and of itself. But that's kind of what we're dealing with here. So again, I didn't really summarize the chapter too much, but I just wanted to sort of build on this idea, and especially there's a notion that what does this actually have to do with contagion and disease, and the idea of that it has to do with something that we imagine ourselves to have been safe, and now we are no longer safe, whether that is through bullying, whether that is through suicide, whatever that is through, whatever the thing that we are attributing a pathological metaphor onto, that this is something that has tainted us, this is something that comes from without, and this is something that prior to some intervention things were okay and now things are not okay. So the idea, again, we start out the book with this notion that we are dealing with things that are both literally diseases and metaphorically diseases as well, where disease becomes the overriding metaphor, and then how disease becomes a metaphor and then turns back into disease as more than simply metaphor. Again, that sort of weird Levi-Straussian double twist, which I talked about last time. So I'm kind of done talking. I just want to go. There are a couple of comments here. Charlotte talked about going to Slenderman. Slenderman's a kind of anti-hero. Andrea Kitta, damn, I'm smart, LOL. Brian, that's really interesting. A bunch of friends on Skype talking about the story of Slenderman before playing the game, similar to being in a car with your friends on the way to Blackbrook, Black Angel. Yeah, I would imagine. Playing the game. There are a couple of different Slenderman games, so yeah, I would imagine that that's something akin to it. You explore that. I would rather you answer that question because you've actually done something similar as opposed to old man McBrody McGillicuddy trying to explain it to you. And Kima, like with the other, we need to find blame. Even if Slenderman or Blue Whale aren't the true cause, we can implement them to assign blame and lessen the fear of the unknown present in the situation. Exactly. With Blue Whale, I mean, you had this rise of suicides among Russian teenagers. And if you can attribute an outside influence, it's doubly so if you can attribute an outside the country influence. At the very least, it is a villain that you can point to, and then you don't have to attribute it to other causes. You don't have to attribute it to depression. You don't have to attribute it to economic uncertainty. You don't have to attribute it to those other things that can similarly lead to systems of despair where suicide is entertained as a viable option. It's like, oh, well, they were perfectly happy, but they got lured into playing a game. Or our youth were perfectly happy, but then they got either a video was encouraging them and victimized them, or perhaps even sort of a spirit came to them. Cool. We've already talked about how sort of fairy belief sometimes has this kind of sinister functional aspect in that it becomes the thing that we talk about. Different from an issue of tellability, because tellability and this is sometimes a matter of the therapeutic element of employing metaphor, as opposed to disguising things by attributing it to other agents. That therefore the evil in the community is beyond our control. So yeah, that's a thing. I am now at 50 minutes. I was trying to do 25. I'm not good at my job. But anyway, I think I'm going to end this nowish. Thank you for showing up. We're going to do this again on Friday. As I said, the backdrop is probably going to be different. I promise you that not only will I be wearing a shirt because I'll be at home, even though I'm at home, I should say, I will also be wearing pants because I just think that's a good thing to do. Yes, y'all knew 25 minutes wasn't happening. Ha 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 ha. Very funny. So this will be up live nowish. I mean, for if you want to review, it takes me a while to edit the slides into the other version, but I'll try and have that by the end of the day. At the very least, I'll have it by tomorrow. For next time, read Chapter 4, Ostensio Mori, when we pretend that we're dead, which I'll talk about that next chapter. As always, be well, be safe. I'm here at the other end of an email if you need me. And otherwise, I'm just going to go because I've been talking for an hour and I'm thirsty. Bye-bye, my friends.